A knighthood, a cricket match, and $7 billion. All one man's con. One Texan fraudster at the center of all of it. Allen Stanford. He landed a helicopter at Lord's carrying chests of gold-painted cash. He got himself knighted by a Caribbean nation he effectively owned. He built a bank that 30,000 investors trusted with their life savings, and for 2 decades, almost nobody looked inside. How do you steal $7 billion in plain sight? And who pays the price when it finally falls apart? A gold-painted chest of cash on one of the most famous cricket grounds in the world, and behind it, nothing but debt. A Ponzi scheme dressed in a Caribbean kingdom, and the question of how it ran for so long before anyone stopped it. Let's go back to the beginning. Allen Stanford was born in 1950 in Mexia, Texas. He attended Baylor University, worked in his family's insurance business, and by the late 1970s had opened a chain of fitness clubs in Houston. That business went bankrupt in 1983, leaving roughly $13 million owed to creditors. Most people at that point recalibrate. Stanford moved faster. 2 years later, in 1985, he opened Guardian International Investment Bank on the Caribbean island of Montserrat. Montserrat was one of a handful of small British territories that had developed a loosely regulated offshore banking sector in the post-war decades. It was a place where a man with a bankrupt fitness club chain and a borrowed suit could start over as a banker. Stanford did exactly that. When Montserrat tightened its offshore regulations in the early 1990s, he relocated. He chose Antigua and Barbuda, a 2-island nation in the eastern Caribbean with a population of under 70,000, and renamed his institution Stanford International Bank. What he was building in Antigua was not simply a bank, it was a relationship. He became the island's largest private employer. He personally funded government building projects, a cricket stadium, and hospital wings. He donated to both major Antiguan political parties. By the mid-2000s, he had constructed what prosecutors would later describe as a situation where the regulator charged with overseeing his bank was, in practice, operating inside the orbit of his economic influence. In 2006, the Antiguan government formalized all of this in the most visible way it could. It knighted him. He became Sir Allen. And that title went into every piece of U.S. marketing material Stanford International Bank produced. In finance, credibility is currency. Stanford had engineered his own supply of it. Here is how the scheme actually worked. Stanford International Bank sold certificates of deposit, CDs, primarily to investors in the United States and Latin America. A certificate of deposit is, in principle, a simple product. You deposit money for a fixed term and collect interest. U.S. banks sell them every day. The difference was the rate. At a time when comparable U.S. bank CDs were paying around 3 to 5% annually, Stanford was offering 7 to 10%. That gap was the engine. It was wide enough to attract tens of thousands of investors who wanted better than average returns, but not so wide that it looked implausible. This is a precise calculation. Madoff, for comparison, promised steadier returns but similar numbers. Stanford's pitch was almost identical in structure, credibility, plus a yield that seemed achievable to someone who didn't look too hard. Investors were told the higher returns came from a sophisticated, actively managed portfolio spread across global equities, bonds, and other instruments. The portfolio largely did not exist in the way described. According to the receiver's forensic accounting and the testimony of Stanford's own CFO James Davis at trial, customer deposits were used to pay the interest owed to earlier depositors. What was left went into speculative real estate ventures and loans to other Stanford-controlled entities. In other words, the interest a 2005 investor collected was paid for by the principal a 2006 investor deposited. That is the mechanical definition of a Ponzi scheme. The offshore structure was not incidental to this. It was load-bearing. Because Stanford International Bank was domiciled in Antigua under Antiguan law, U.S. regulators had no direct supervisory reach. The financial statements investors received were certified locally. And prosecutors alleged at trial that the regulatory apparatus in Antigua was effectively compromised by Stanford's dominance of the island's economy and politics. The SEC had in fact opened a preliminary examination of the bank's CD products as early as 1997. It did not result in enforcement action for more than a decade. 30,000 investors kept depositing. The scheme kept running. So by late 2008, Alan Stanford had built something that looked, from the outside, like a legitimate Caribbean financial empire. He had a knighthood, a globally recognized brand, a regulator that wasn't asking hard questions, and 30,000 investors who had no reason to believe the portfolio behind their CDs was a fiction. What he did next was put himself on television in front of the entire cricket world. In October 2008, Stanford sponsored the Stanford Super Series, a $20 million winner. Take-all cricket match at Lord's Cricket Ground in London, the most famous cricket ground on Earth. He arrived by helicopter. He was flanked by chests painted gold and filled with cash. The match was between his own team, the Stanford Superstars, and the England national side. The Superstars won. The England and Wales Cricket Board had agreed to this arrangement, and the spectacle was broadcast globally. The ECB would later be widely criticized for accepting the sponsorship without adequate due diligence. 4 months before Stanford's bank collapsed, he had purchased the single most high-profile piece of reputational credibility money could buy. And the credibility was still working. Investors were still depositing. But something had already shifted. The global financial crisis of late 2008 had rattled markets. Depositors across the investment world were moving toward redemptions. For a Ponzi scheme, redemption pressure is a death clock because there is no real portfolio to liquidate. At Stanford International Bank, the gap between what was owed and what existed was enormous. By February 2009, the cash flow could not be maintained. On 17 February 2009, the SEC filed a civil complaint alleging an approximately $8 billion fraud against Stanford and associated entities. Within days, the England and Wales Cricket Board severed its commercial relationship. 2 days after the SEC complaint, on 19 February, a U.S. federal court appointed Ralph Janvey as receiver over Stanford International Bank's assets. The lock had turned on the vault, and the vault was almost empty. Stanford was indicted by a federal grand jury in Houston in June 2009 on 21 counts, including wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. While in pretrial detention in September 2009, he was severely beaten by another inmate and suffered a concussion. His legal team argued the assault had caused memory loss severe enough to prevent him from participating meaningfully in his own defense. After psychiatric evaluation, a federal court declared him competent to stand trial. The trial ran from January to March 2012. James Davis, Stanford's former CFO, who had pleaded guilty in 2009 and agreed to cooperate with prosecutors, testified about falsified financial statements. On 6 March 2012, Stanford was convicted on 13 of his 14 counts. On 14 June 2012, he was sentenced to 110 years in federal prison. Laura Pendergast Holt, who had served as chief investment officer, was convicted of obstruction of justice and sentenced to 3 years. Davis received 5 years following his cooperation. The 30,000 investors who had trusted Stanford International Bank with their money had lost a combined approximately $7.2 billion. Receiver Ralph Janvey has, as of the most recent court-supervised reports, recovered approximately $1.2 billion through asset liquidations and third-party clawbacks. That leaves roughly $6 billion unrecovered. For most of the people who lost money, the recovery will be pennies on the dollar. Stanford is currently serving his sentence at a federal facility in Florida. He has continued to maintain his innocence, arguing in public statements that the receivership, not his own conduct, destroyed the bank's value. Alan Stanford is now in his mid-70s, serving what is effectively a life sentence in a federal prison in Florida. The cricket stadium he built still stands in Antigua. The knighthood has never been formally revoked. The lesson most clearly written into this story is also the most uncomfortable one. The scheme ran for at least a decade after the SEC opened its first look at it in 1997. It ran because the offshore structure put it just outside the reach of the regulators who might have stopped it. It ran because the yields were high enough to attract investors, but moderate enough not to trigger immediate alarm. And it ran because a man with a bankrupt fitness club chain understood that credibility, a title, a cricket match, a helicopter full of gold-painted cash, can be manufactured, and that manufactured credibility is often indistinguishable from the real thing. Here is a question worth sitting with. When you look at that 2008 Lord's match, the helicopter, the chests, the knighthood, the $20 million winner-take-all spectacle, how many of those signals would have made you more confident in the bank, not less? If that question has an uncomfortable answer, let me know in the comments. I think a lot of people's would. And if you want more stories like this one, cases where the fraud ran in full public view before anyone could name it, subscribe. There's a lot more here.